Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just get myself in order here. All right, there's the pointer. So we're going to kind of begin at the beginning and just very quickly, what is watercolor? Watercolor paint is made with dry pigments. This dry pigment can come from an organic source, such as indigo from a plant or cochineal from an insect, or from an inorganic source, like raw umber from the earth, or emerald green, a pigment synthesized from copper and arsenic. These powdery pigments are finely ground and at the same time mixed in a binder, and that's what's being done right down here. The binder is what holds the particles of pigment to the paper support. Gum arabic and gum tragacanth, both from plants, are the traditional binders used for watercolor. Honey and glycerin are sometimes added to help consistency, and a material called oxgall is added to help the pigment particles disperse evenly in the solution. Watercolor is one of the earliest forms of painting. Primitive man used pigments mixed with water to create cave paintings. During the Middle Ages, monks used watercolor to create illuminated manuscripts. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, Renaissance artists like Albrecht Dürer and Hans Boll painted in watercolor. In India and Persia, various white pigments were added to make a more opaque watercolor paint. Watercolor painting reached its pinnacle, though, in Britain in the 18th century. And I won't talk a lot about that because I think Robin will be touching upon that a little, except to say that during this time period in this golden age of watercolor, professional societies started to form, allowing artists to share technical information and promoting the medium's status relative to oil painting in an increasingly competitive market for art. And this popularity and spread of watercolor during this golden age really corresponded with the evolution and advancements in the color making and paper making industries, which is what I'm going to talk about. So watercolor painters before the 18th century had to make the paints themselves, purchasing the paint and binder separately from apothecaries. In the 18th century, colormen came on the scene. They began inventing ways to supply paint with the binder and pigment already mixed together and ready to use. In 1781, colormen William and Thomas Reeves invented the moist watercolor cake, which was immediately soluble when touched with a wet brush and would have looked similar to these paints here in this box. In 1846, the colormen Winsor and Newton introduced colors packaged in metal tubes, like the one seen here in the top center. These important advances in the color-making industry helped to revolutionize the ease with which artists could work and their ability to paint outdoors, heralding the popularity of painting en plein air. Unfortunately, there were no regulations regarding consistency of color names, nor in preventing adulterants or fillers from being added to the paints. One colorman's sap green paint, for example, might include Italian pink, gamboge, and indigo, and that's shown in this recipe from a recipe book of the colorman Charles Roberson. While another colorman's sap green might have yellow lake and Prussian blue added instead, as I found in a Winsor and Newton recipe. Another innovation that influenced the rise of watercolor painting related to the paper available to artists. Before the 1750s, handmade paper was formed using a mold made of thinly spaced wires running in one direction and widely spaced wires in another, and this is the mold here in the upper left. Paper made on this type of mold is known as laid or laid-in-chain paper. When you look at laid paper with transmitted light, that's light shining through the paper as seen in the bottom left, you'll see the impressions left by both the laid and the chain wires. These laid and chain wires could become visible then when the watercolor painter was painting on that type of paper. In the 1750s, papermaker James Whatman introduced wove papers. Wove paper is made with a mold that has a woven screen, as seen in the upper right, rather than the laden chain wires. This woven mesh imparts a smoother surface to the paper. And within a decade of then, Whatman paper mills, followed by other paper makers, were making paper especially for watercolor that were treated with a coating to prevent washes from sinking into the fibers. This coating, known as sizing, was most commonly made with gelatin. The greater the amount of sizing, the more resistant the paper will be to damage from manipulation during painting, particularly while wet, which allowed the artist more time to work and make changes. And this was a vast improvement for watercolor painters. By the mid to late 19th century, when Whistler was painting, watercolor papers were manufactured with specific surface textures called rough, cold-pressed, and hot-pressed. Rough denotes a paper that had been air-dried after being formed, leaving a rough surface, and you can see this in the upper left. Cold-pressed, which was also sometimes called not, which means not hot-pressed, denotes a paper that's been repeatedly pressed between the paper-making felts during the drying process to sort of flatten and smooth the paper surface, and that sample's in the middle. And then finally, hot-pressed indicates a paper that had been rolled between heated metal plates or rollers to compress the paper fibers and give a very smooth surface. So watercolor paper, and actually watercolor paper today is still made with those surfaces for watercolor paper painting. Watercolor paint takes on a different appearance when brushed across these three surfaces, lying more smoothly on a hot-pressed paper and less evenly on a rough surface, as you can see in these three details that were actually taken from the Whistler works on view upstairs. Now, our study of Whistler's watercolors here included the 52 watercolors at the Freer. We used a number of different analytical methods to uncover previously unknown information, some of which I will share with you now. In addition to the Freer collection, we looked at another 81 watercolors from 19 museums around the United States and Europe, resulting in a significant body of information about Whistler's works. We began by looking at known Whistler watercolor materials. All the supplies that had remained in the artist's studio after his death were donated by Whistler's sister-in-law, Rosalind Burney Phillip, to the Hunterian Art Gallery in Glasgow. They include watercolors and gouache paints in tubes and bottles made by the colorman Dr. Schoenfeld and Company, a German paint manufacturer established in 1862, and two London-based colormen, Windsor and Newton, established in 1832, and James Newman, established in 1784. Additionally, 2 watercolor palettes, a mixing tray, and the lid of a wooden box all have remnants of mixed watercolors. So these are all the materials pictured here. New information about Whistler's purchases of watercolor supplies was uncovered in the sales records in the archives of colorman Charles Roberson and Company. This ledger book, shown at the left, shows that Whistler began making purchases from Roberson in January 1881. Whistler likely turned to Roberson because he had left numerous other London colormen with unpaid bills after his bankruptcy. So the ledger book contains really a wealth of information. Between 1881 and 1883, the beginning of Whistler's most prolific period painting watercolors, he purchased numerous supplies. For example, on October 11th, Whistler purchased camel hair brushes, sable brushes, a block of paper, a waterproof sketching bag, a japanned water bottle, and watercolor paints, all equipment essential for working outdoors. And this purchase was immediately before he went on a painting trip to the Channel Islands. The other records in the archives confirmed that Whistler was buying his watercolor paints in tubes, and the description of this 18-tube watercolor box from the ledger matches almost exactly the palette at the Hunterian. And this is the palette on the left, and this is actually a picture from the Roberson archives of the palette they were selling. Computed X-radiography was undertaken on the 52 Freer works to look for watermarks, which can be used to help identify papermakers. A watermark is made from a wire attached to that papermaking mold I showed you earlier. And during manufacture, the wet paper pulp settles more thinly in the area of that watermark, which appears then more translucent when you hold the paper up to transmitted light. So far we've identified 5 watermarks in our Whistler works. And it's interesting because in his early watercolors, those painted before the bankruptcy, Whistler was using papers not necessarily intended for work in watercolor, including laid papers. 3 out of the 5 watermarks appear in works painted during a trip with fellow artist Ernest Delanoy in the Rhineland in 1858. So the watermark on the left, the initials LL in a wreath, has been identified by a paper historian as that of a French stationer, and was found in 2 different versions of the kitchen that we have. In the upper right, you can see a partial watermark that reads Blau, B-L-A-U-W, and that's found in papers made by 17th century Dutch papermaker Dirk and Cornelis Blau. However, it's unclear whether this is a Dutch paper, because the watermark is known to have been copied by French papermakers throughout the 18th and 19th century. In the lower right, we also found what's called a blind stamp, or embossing, in paper that reads Frère. This blind stamp could have been from a number of French papermakers with Frère in their name, but has not yet been firmly linked to one specific papermaker. Changes in Whistler's choices of paper can be seen from the watermarks found in his papers in Venice and after. We found a J. Watman Turkey Mill watermark, and I realize this is hard to see, but this actually says J. Watman Turkey Mill on Venice Harbor on the left. And another partial Watman watermark was found on Nocturne, Grand Canal, Amsterdam, seen on the right. After 1880, I would say about 80% of all of Whistler's watercolors were found to be on traditional wove watercolor papers. Whistler knew his watercolors would be more successful if he used papers specifically made for that purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, James Watman, who was the inventor of wove paper, the paper from his mills was really at this point in time considered the finest watercolor paper available. So the Roberson Ledger book also includes the information that Whistler purchased at least 16 blocks of paper. A block is made with sheets of paper compressed and sealed around the edges, except for one unsealed section. And you can see that both in this drawing and in this example of a block in the Hunterian collection of Whistler's works. Once the top sheet was used, it could be separated by inserting a sharp tool into the opening, running it around the edges to cut the adhesive, and releasing the top sheet. And as I mentioned upstairs, for those of you who were there, blocks made it easier for watercolor artists to travel and paint outdoors. Whistler's use of blocks was confirmed by the presence of blue fiber along the edges of at least 23 of his works. And that's what you see in all of these pictures, which were taken from the Whistler watercolors in our collection. We also learned from the ledger that Whistler bought 7 hot-pressed blocks and 7 cold-pressed blocks, with 2 being unidentified. Although Whistler used the hot and cold pressed papers in equal numbers, 2 discernible trends became apparent. He used the cold-pressed blocks mainly for his seascapes and preferred the smooth, hot-pressed surface for a majority of his street scenes. There are at least 5 fabric-covered boards from 1888 that bear the stamp of colormen E. Marais and Fee. These boards are all the same size and have the maker's stamp on the verso. Although these boards were probably manufactured for oil painting with a pre-prepared ground layer in oil, Whistler experimented with these nonetheless, and he was always a bit of an experimenter. 11 watercolors were painted on Japanese paper, such as the image shown on the left. Whistler used Japanese papers for his etchings and was well aware that the surface could be soft, unsized, and not conducive to painting in watercolor, yet he experimented with them as well. Whistler had always favored rough brown papers for his pastel drawings, and this is one of his pastels, a study for the Morning Glories. And he produced at least 9 watercolors on this support, including blue and gold, the rose azalea on the right. Throughout the 19th century, discoveries of new colorants extended the palette available to artists. Yet with the exception of cobalt blue, which was a more modern pigment, Whistler's early watercolors relied primarily on well-established pigments. A variety of ochres, lamp and bone black, vermilion, indigo, and Prussian blue, as well as lead white, were the primary pigments used in the early Frère watercolors. Like the shift that took place with Whistler's choices of wove papers in the 1880s, a similar change occurred with his palette. This was confirmed using non-destructive analytical methods, including fluorescence and reflectance spectroscopy, which can identify the elements that make up the pigments. London Bridge, painted before September 1881, seen here on the left, was the last work painted using cobalt blue. Note in Blue and Opal Jersey on the right was painted using cerulean blue during a trip to the Channel Islands in November 1881, which occurred right after his purchase from Roberson in October 1881. We think Whistler, being economical after his bankruptcy, switched to cerulean blue because it's a cheaper pigment. London Bridge is also one of the latest works to include an underdrawing. A striking element of Whistler's technique after 1881 is that he no longer created a sketch after painting. With his new focus on watercolors in the 1880s, Whistler expanded his palette and used more of the newly available modern pigments. He added cadmium and lemon yellows, as well as emerald green, to his palette. He continued to use Prussian blue and indigo, as well as the newly added cerulean blue. So very little has been written about Whistler's working techniques in watercolor painting. Whistler's followers, students, and acquaintances, all of whom wrote about their experiences with Whistler after his death, made little mention of his watercolors. A trove of Whistler correspondence survives, but answers few questions. The only information comes from Whistler's follower Mortimer Mempes, who wrote, quote, "In watercolors, Whistler always used Chinese white with every tone to give body to the pigment, just as in his oil colors he used ivory black." Whistler indeed added zinc white to his paints, and he did so in almost all watercolors after 1880. We know this because zinc white can give a yellow-colored fluorescence when exposed to ultraviolet light, as seen in these two images. And what these pictures show is that he alternated between sometimes using the zinc white in discrete areas, such as South End Sunset on the left, and you can see that from this yellow fluorescence only in the clouds. Alternatively, he would mix the zinc white into almost every pigment, such as in Pink Note, the novelette, which is this image on the right that glows yellow almost overall. Despite the addition of zinc white, which traditionally was always used to make watercolor a more opaque paint, less transparent, a majority of Whistler's watercolors actually appear quite transparent. So the terms gouache or opaque watercolor have implications that don't seem to fit with these works. Alternatively, calling them watercolors doesn't convey the fact that they incorporate zinc white. And this is sort of a question of terminology that is unanswered at this point, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on what they think that correct terminology should be. While the watercolors appear quite simple and dashed off, many are actually reworked. One example is a change made to the skirt in the reclining figure of Millie Finch, which was revealed during examination using reflected infrared light. And this, the image right here is what's called a reflected infrared image, which can sort of see through the paint and reveal underdrawings and changes made below the top paint surface. And what you can see is that the paint was spread, the skirt was spread much wider, and then Whistler painted over it, making a change. Examination with a microscope can also reveal areas that have been reworked. Disturbed fibers in the paper indicating rubbing and wiping are seen in this detail of a face in Harmony in Violet and Amber. Another microscopic detail, this one from Chelsea Children, shows how Whistler blotted an area to remove color, creating a highlight. As artists transitioned from formulating their own paints to purchasing ready-made paints from the colormen in the 19th century, concern about the permanence of artists' material was real. Watercolor painting manuals of the day gave information on the permanence of pigments and advice on recommended palettes, while manufacturers began to include information about their pigments in their catalogs. When he was once asked why he did not use the expensive and brilliant colors currently in vogue, Whistler responded that he didn't think they could be trusted to look the same over time, saying, quote, "The old masters used simple pigments which they ground themselves. I try to use what they used." Despite this lofty notion, Whistler in fact relied on readily accessible modern paints. A critic's review of Whistler's 1884 exhibition described this painting on the left, a note in green, as a girl just touched with vivid green. She stands in front of a blazing yellow background. Now you can only see traces of this bright yellow along the left edge, and you can't see this upstairs, only in this picture, where the frame actually protected that side edge from light, while the yellows in the rest of the painting have dulled. We've confirmed the presence of a strontium chromate yellow, which is usually called lemon yellow when you buy it, and this is known to display a color shift from light exposure. So part of what our research is doing is helping us to understand and identify some of the visual changes that have taken place in these works over time. And finally, I want to end just with a picture of our book, and also to let you know that you should keep your eye out for Whistler in Watercolor Online, which is a resource that's going to be to debut in December 2019, and it's going to include all of our ultraviolet, infrared, and X-ray images, as well as detailed pictures taken through the microscope and pigment analysis findings. Thank you.